Good evening, and welcome to tonight's John A. Widtsoe Foundation virtual conversation, Church History and the World, Joseph Smith's Kirtland Revelations. Our guest this evening is Mark Staker of the Historic Sites Division of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and author of Hearken, O Ye People, the historical setting of Joseph Smith's Ohio Revelations. Dr. Staker and I have known each other for decades, and I will introduce him more fully in a moment. But before doing that, I want to mention next month's Church History and the World conversation. It will take place on August 22nd, and we will have two guests that evening. One will be Kate Holbrook, Managing Historian of the Church History Department of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and an expert on Latter-day Saint foodways. Joining her will be Samuel M. Brown, a practicing physician and professor at the University of Utah School of Medicine. Our topic for the evening will be the Word of Wisdom, section 89 of the Doctrine and Covenants. We anticipate an interesting and lively conversation, and we invite you to be with us for that occasion. I want to remind you that previous conversations, including last month's with Dr. Robin Jensen of the Joseph Smith Papers on the Book of Commandments, are available at the John A. Widtsoe Foundation website, www.widtsoefoundation.org. You can also register for next month's conversation at that site. We'd like to remind you of the format for these conversations. We will begin this evening with a conversation between Dr. Staker and me. I will pose questions to him to initiate the conversation and move it along. Meanwhile, we invite you as audience members to craft your own questions, which we'll begin addressing about half or two-thirds of the way through the hour. You should be able to submit your questions to us on the software program through which you are listening to this conversation this evening. Now let me introduce Dr. Staker in more detail. Mark Staker received a PhD in anthropology from the University of Florida, and he has worked for 27 years in the Church History Department of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He is currently a master curator in the Historic Sites Division of that department, responsible for accurately recreating and interpreting the physical settings of the early church. As I mentioned earlier, he is the author of the well-acclaimed volume, Hearken, O Ye People, the historical setting of Joseph Smith's Ohio Revelations. His most recent book, which has been out only for a few months, is Joseph and Lucy's Tunbridge, Vermont Farm, an Archaeology and Landscape Study. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Rick. Appreciate being here.
Each of us as individuals interpret what we encounter in life through our own background and experiences. Mark, how does your experience as an anthropologist influence how you think about the revelations published in the Doctrine and Covenants?
Let me jump back a little bit to some of my anthropological training, and then I had a profound experience while I was doing field work in Suriname that has shaped my thinking ever since, that I want to share with you because I think it'll help us kind of organize what we talk about today. And that is, some 35 years ago, when I started out in anthropology, I learned that there is a way some anthropologists, cognitive anthropologists, think about culture in terms of being very similar to a language. So, for example, when you're learning a language as a child, your parents or your language community constantly corrects you, and you adjust until you learn to speak with the right accent, using the right words, and using a grammar that you inherit that you don't even know. You know, as a 5-year-old child, you don't understand what grammar is, but you're using it, and you're using it competently. And anthropologists talk about a grammar of culture as well. And I had this in mind as I went out to do field work, and I had not at that time thought about the Doctrine and Covenants in those terms. But if you look in the Doctrine and Covenants in the beginning section of the Doctrine and Covenants, verse 24, it talks about that I will I don't remember the exact wording, but you can look it up. It's essentially that I talk to you in your language, you know, and in your weakness. In the Book of Mormon, Second Nephi, it uses that word weakness, but it repeats that same idea that I'm going to communicate with you in your language, on your level. And I always thought of that as a verbal language. Oh, God talked to Joseph Smith in English because that's the language that Joseph Smith knew. You know, he didn't know Adamic, he didn't know something else, and speaking something else. But I had an experience in Suriname that changed my perspective, and that is when I was there. Paramaribo, Suriname, it's the capital of a small country just north of Brazil. And I was doing my doctoral dissertation research there. And it was medical anthropology subject. So I worked in the hospital, and I was working with the traditional religious community there, looking at the voodoo, the spirits, and how they interacted with them to heal people. But I was an active Latter-day Saint, and so I was involved in my it wasn't even a branch at the time, it was just a group of some members there. And one of those I became good friends with. My friend and I, we worked a lot together on different things. We were out weeding together one day, and as it got very hot in the day and time to take a break, we were eating lunch in the shade and talking. And I thought it would be a good time to just talk to him about Joseph Smith. And so I said to my friend Philly, you know, what do you know about Joseph Smith? Oh, he said, he had this vision, saw God the Father and his son, Jesus Christ. And a while later, an angel came to him and he told him about these golden plates buried in a hill. And Joseph translated them, and that's how we have the Book of Mormon. Philly couldn't read very well, didn't have really experience writing, but he was quite knowledgeable in his culture. He taught me lots of things, a very capable individual. But because he didn't have that educational background, I thought I would help him along and, you know, learning about Joseph Smith. And so I thinking of Isaiah, I said, oh, you know, he was the prophets prophesied that he'd be an unlearned man, you know, and translate the scriptures. And he looked at me and he said, "Oh, Ibiwan Juka," you know, in the Creole language area, he was a Juka, and I didn't know the word Juka. And so I said, "Well, what's Juka?" I know the Juka people. They're the Busunangri, the Bush Negroes, live in the rainforest. You think that Joseph Smith was one of them? And he said, no, we say that when somebody doesn't know how to live properly, if they put a cup of water on the ground instead of up on the table, they're behaving like a Juka, they're Juka. And so if Joseph Smith, you know, was unlearned, he was Juka, he didn't know how to behave properly. And I said, oh, well, no, he knew how to behave properly, but I didn't quite know how to answer that. So we just continued on in our conversation. And I told him a few more things about Joseph Smith. Oh, well, he cast, the first miracle in the church was he cast the devil out of Newell Night. And he said, oh, well, did he take Bimba, the white chalk, and put it all over his body to control that spirit? And so that he could then direct it. And I said, no, I don't think he did that. I don't recall having read that in his account. And he was a little puzzled by that. And I knew, but I'd read a lot about the Njuka, and I knew that they did exactly that kind of thing to control the spirits. And so our conversation continued, and I said, oh, you know, he was put in prison and murdered, and it was mostly over a printing press, and that the government of Nauvoo had prohibited this printing press, and that he was involved in that, so they put him in jail. And he knew a lot about troubled governments and problems because they had those in his country. But then I added on to that, oh, and maybe some people participated in killing him because he had a lot of wives. And his eyes brightened up and he said, see, I told you he was Juka, you know, because the Juka people in the rainforest have practiced polygyny. They have multiple wives. And so I felt I'd lost the argument there. But I turned back to my understanding of anthropology and the idea of a culture as a language. And so I began to explain to my friend the nature of a culture, and that the Juka people of the rainforest grow up differently, but they aren't unlearned. They aren't they're uneducated, but they have knowledge and they have abilities. They just have a different culture and a different way of seeing the world than Philly had. I think that eventually that I was able to make my case that Joseph Smith was learned in the way of having a culture and growing up with a culture, but that he was unlearned in the ability to read and write well the same way that Philly was. But that encounter with my friend shaped my understanding of Joseph Smith ever after, because I recognized in that you can see him very, very differently depending on your background and where you're coming from. And I had always assumed that I knew Joseph because I was an American and he was an American. You know, I spoke English, he spoke English. And it wasn't until probably a year and a half later when I was hired to work for the church history department, and I ran into Don Enders, a colleague of mine there, who I knew that cultural context well. And I sat down and began asking him question after question, trying to figure out what was Joseph Smith's life like, because I knew that I was not prepared to understand Joseph the way I was. And that shaped, for the next 30 years, I've continued to think in those terms of trying to understand Joseph Smith and his revelations and that language that God used to speak to Joseph Smith that was not just the English language, but his cultural language.
So here we are in 2020, and I think, as you mentioned for yourself, a lot of us, particularly as Latter-day Saints who speak English as our native language, we somehow believe that we can easily understand Joseph Smith because we think we're from the same culture. But Joseph Smith, who began noting his revelations, receiving his revelations some 200 years ago in the 1820s, lived in quite a different culture, did he not? Can you give us some examples of cultural things that may help us better understand the Doctrine and Covenants?
Yeah, I can. It's true. The past is a foreign country. It's just as foreign to, we may think that it's, we know that past, but it's just as foreign to us as Suriname was to me when I went there as a graduate student. But a couple of examples that come to mind. One, I know you're going to talk next week about the word of wisdom, but I thought I would share some thoughts with that because I know that you're familiar with that revelation, and that one has some language in it that we would well, let's think of it on two levels. One is the vocabulary, and then the second level is the deeper grammar. And the vocabulary of that language, we would quickly recognize that the things that Joseph Smith's hearing and using aren't necessarily appropriate for, say, West Africa. You know, if Joseph Smith had been born in among the Ashanti in Western Africa and received that revelation in 1833, it would talk about cassava and yams and sorghum as appropriate things to eat. And you know, you should be eating these things. And the things you ought to avoid, apio, which is translated into English as hot drink, but it's not hot in terms of temperature. It's hot in terms of, it has a very high alcohol content. It's a palm wine. But you would think in those kinds of vocabulary terms, you'd replace the foods. But if you look carefully at the revelation, there's a deep grammar there as well that the Lord is using. It talks about beasts of the field as opposed to wild animals. And so Joseph has those classifications, domesticated animals, undomesticated animals, that he's used to thinking of. And so he understands those prohibitions in that way. There are people in Western Africa, friends of mine, who eat grubs that you would leave in a tree and raise in a tree, and so or mounds of termites, and those are entirely appropriate beasts of the not beasts of the field, but wild animals. But it doesn't fit the context that Joseph Smith's addressing, in terms of providing grain and other things for them, because those are the kind of animals that Joseph's used to thinking about. And we can extrapolate and say, oh, well, they'd fit into this category or that. But that's where a modern prophet comes into play. That's why a modern prophet is so essential, because the revelation that Joseph Smith received was for his time and place. And the other point that I wanted to make from the word of wisdom, I think it becomes even clearer, and that is there are three classifications of drink. You have strong drink, you have wine, and you have mild drink. Well, strong drink for Joseph would have been a gin or rum or whiskey. And there's a whole book written on it at the time period, and lots of discussion about Gin Alley or Beer Street. And Gin Alley is the morally reprobate, and those who abandon their families. Beer Street is the wholesome, the hard worker, those people who are doing what's right. And so if you read the book of the Word of Wisdom from that context, you can see that construction, that way of thinking about drink is right there. That strong drink is prohibited and beer is encouraged. So I know you're going to go home tonight and put on Facebook, Mark Staker says that the Word of Wisdom tells us we can drink beer. And at that time, in that context, and in that place, yes, the Word of Wisdom, mild drinks of barley, cider. Hard cider is a perfect way of preserving the cider so that it stays healthy and you don't end up getting sick from it. Water wasn't really a safe drink. I know W.W. Phelps, as soon as the revelation was received, was talking about drinking water, and embracing that, but not everybody did. It wasn't necessarily a healthy way to approach it. But that's where Heber J. Grant later on, then as a new prophet, receives more revelation that allows us to then recognize that beer is also something that we don't drink. But he used the original revelation, but he received new revelation in the process to allow us to understand that better. So there are two things going on there. One is the vocabulary, and then the other is that cultural grammar. And you find that in other places in the Doctrine and Covenants as well. Just another real short example that I'll share is when I was restoring the Harmony, Pennsylvania church history sites and looking at those revelations carefully and pondering them, I was struck by section 4 of the Doctrine and Covenants that Joseph Smith receives on behalf of his father. And you may recognize the words, the field is white, all ready to harvest, thrust in your sickle. And I pondered that situation. Why sickle? His father wouldn't have used a sickle. That's for old folks. And for women and children, his father would have used a scythe. Is Joseph thinking of his father as being old and not really capable of doing a full day's work anymore? And as I thought that through, I recognized that in that cultural context, thrusting your sickle it's a biblical term too. And so it resonates there. But in that context, thrusting your sickle means that the revelation is not just for Joseph Smith Sr., but it's for women. It's for the old. It's for the young. It's for everybody. And the idea of a sickle is going through the field and gathering one by one, or two in a village and three in a household, and smaller groups, rather than just going through and harvesting the whole field all at once. And so it had powerful symbolic connotations to it that the Joseph Smith's contemporaries would have gotten much better than we would, because we're so far removed from using a sickle, or at least most of us have probably never used one, and don't really understand the difference between a sickle and a scythe, or that context. And so we miss that because we don't have that.
I know that many of us who like to study the scriptures try to go back to the original language. For example, I spent some time studying Koine Greek of the New Testament so that I could understand things. And I frequently will go to my Greek New Testament to see what the original words were that have been translated later on in English. And then I try to figure out what those words meant at the time. And of course, many people do the same with Hebrew in the Old Testament. What I'm hearing from you is that perhaps we should be doing the same thing with the Doctrine and Covenants. We should be looking at the original word meanings for the time period in which the Lord was speaking to Joseph in his own culture and language. Is that correct?
Absolutely. It's and I used my wife actually purchased Noah Webster's dictionary from the period that I use regularly, just to get a sense of, now, what does that word mean for Joseph in his context, and is that a little different than maybe we might use it? The word curious pops into mind. For example, the Book of Mormon was Joseph talked about the characters being of curious workmanship, and we might think that meant strange and unusual, and for him it meant very carefully produced, which Orson Pratt described as well, that they were etched in and then a black bitumen kind of rubbed into them. And so different meanings at times.
One of our listeners has just posted that dictionary's online version for our listeners to access. You don't have to go out and try to find one in hard copy. You can use it online today. Let's talk for a moment about whether the Lord ever went beyond Joseph's own vocabulary or culture in giving him revelations that might be intended perhaps for a broader audience, or perhaps to have meaning later. What do you think of that idea?
Yeah, it makes sense that if Joseph already knew everything and the Lord were just repeating his cultural context, then the revelations wouldn't have much meaning. But they're also bringing in new ideas, or twisting his traditional cultural concepts in some way or another. One example of that is section 76 of the Doctrine and Covenants. That was actually the first historic site that I was called on to address was the John and Elsa Johnson home in Hiram, Ohio. We had a tour group walking through the upstairs of that home, and the floor gave way under the 15 people. It was just too old and fragile, and so we had to shut the building down and begin immediately restoration. So I was working very fast, trying to understand the context of what happened there and what was its significance. And most of that, of course, focused on the home itself and restoring the home. But one of the things that I came to understand as I went through the writings of Alexander Campbell, the disciple of Christ, minister that was very influential in that area. He, Walter Scott, and Sidney Rigdon were called the Three Witnesses. because witnesses were very important in their congregation and their community. And Sidney Rigdon knew very well Alexander Campbell's teachings. Well, Campbell in 1827 published what he said was a vision that he had had with Simeon, a Jewish Christian, 8 years after the resurrection of Jesus Christ, had joined the church and came back to Campbell and explained to him this notion of three kingdoms. Paul, of course, in the New Testament talks about, the third heaven, and Emanuel Swedenborg and others had written about it, but not so directly connected to the Latter-day Saint community as Alexander Campbell, because at least 3, 4 that come to mind, 4 of his ministers joined the Latter-day Saints. Most of the members there in Kirtland and in Hiram were former disciples of Christ. They knew this information thoroughly. Well, Joseph Smith, as he's working on the Bible translation, he mentions in passing, and we emphasize heavily, he says, well, as we came to John chapter 5, we had these questions, but if you read carefully the wording, he says, we had received numerous revelations beforehand, and we were considering other information. Joseph, his cultural grammar that he gets from his parents is dualistic to an extent. His father was raised primarily as a Universalist. The family were Universalists at least by 1790 and probably as early as 1776. And so for decades, Joseph's father had been a Universalist, which meant what? That they didn't believe in angels, don't believe in visions, don't believe in the Holy Ghost influencing people to do the kinds of things that, say, Methodists believe, falling to the ground and having these ecstatic experiences. And they considered the Holy Ghost was the scriptures. And they approached things through and the Enlightenment, that you considered the rational thought was your primary means of gaining insight. And so when Joseph Smith Sr. goes with Lucy to some Methodist meetings and his father comes and throws Thomas Paine's book Common Sense into the house, it's not necessary because Thomas Paine's also belittles Christ to an extent. He is not as Christian as the Universalists, as Aisles, but it's not that aspect that he's trying to get Joseph Sr. to adopt. It's the rational thought, the common sense. Well, Joseph Smith Jr. grows up with that kind of approach. And so Oliver Cowdery, when he's trying to translate the Book of Mormon, remember section 6, he gives no thought, but just to ask for revelation. Joseph Smith Jr. Naturally thinks through things rationally before he then turns to his mother's background, which is a visionary world, to seek revelation. And so he's combining both his father's and his mother's background to accomplish what he needs to accomplish. So Alexander Campbell then had been teaching that there were three kingdoms. That Simeon that I mentioned had taught him that there were three kingdoms: a kingdom of faith, kingdom of glory, and a kingdom of works. And he talks a little bit about what will put you in each kingdom. And if you're familiar with the vision of section 76, you can see how the answers Joseph received tied into that. So Joseph had these ideas, he pondered them, he had this cultural language, if you will, and then God took that and expanded beyond that to shift his understanding into something entirely new.
Great. Are there other examples that you could give us? I think we'd earlier had some communication about section 46 and gifts of the Spirit. You want to talk about that for a minute?
Sure can. Joseph's not the only one bringing his culture and his background to seeking revelation. All of the members that join the church there in Kirtland have a background as well that they're bringing to that. And I emphasize in the book that I'd written on the Revelations, one of those individuals, trying to highlight him as maybe somebody that's overlooked and unnoticed because a lot get attention. I don't know his full name. He went by Black Pete. That seems to be the name that he preferred. He had dropped his slave owners. He'd grown up in slavery, which means that his last name could have been his slave owner's name, but I don't know that. But Black Pete had grown up with a mother from West Africa, Kino, and he had inherited the African slave religion that was practiced in southern Pennsylvania, where he grew up. And as he went to Kirtland, Ohio, he introduces that to the Disciples of Christ community that he's a part of, as they're trying to restore what they find in Acts chapter 2 of the original Christian church. And one of those is, the Holy Ghost and its influence in their lives. And so Black Pete is, they say he becomes a prophet among them. He's very influential. And individuals are trying to figure out what the gifts of the Spirit are and how those influence people. So ultimately, it's his introduction of those ideas to that community that leads to Joseph Smith getting a revelation on the subject, section 46 of the Doctrine and Covenants, that beautifully outlines all of these gifts of the Spirit. There are more answers there than the Black Pete had offered initially as gifts. So the revelation offers a much more expansive role for those gifts of the Spirit and more insight into them. But Black Pete was the one that had initiated that conversation and that revelation. And it continues actually for another couple of months after that revelation is given, as they receive more of revelation and more insight on that subject.
So what you're talking about then is the importance of understanding the cultural context of the revelations. You're a historic sites curator. How does the historical setting, the physical setting, also help us understand the revelations?
Thank you. Yeah, I would like to kind of add that in, because I've learned that as we try to explore these revelations outside of any context, that we often misjudge things, or we make errors of interpretation. When I was working on Harmony, Pennsylvania, and restoring the homes there, we restored Isaac and Elizabeth Hale's home, where Emma had grown up, and then her brother Jesse and his wife Mary Hale's home that Joseph and Emma Smith purchased from them. And trying to figure out from that, how did the Aaronic priesthood unfold? And there were a lot of sources that added insight into that. And as I looked at all those sources, and the heading to that section of the Doctrine and Covenants, section 13, that said they went to the banks of the Susquehanna River and prayed, and John the Baptist appeared to them, it didn't fit. And I couldn't understand why. If you read section 128 of the Doctrine and Covenants, it talks about Peter, James, and John appearing on the banks of the Susquehanna River, but not not John the Baptist. And what I found was that the river was flooding on that day, and the water level was up 10 feet above the banks of the river, and it would have covered everything on both sides of the river. I found it was a very, very busy river because it was flooding. All the ships were heading downriver. They waited until it flooded so that they could flow down easily to the Philadelphia market. They'd get off in Lancaster County, unload all their goods and take them over to Philadelphia. It was like a highway, you know. Why would you go down to a highway? And Oliver Cowdery talked about we went far away from the abodes of men. And as you looked at the wording of the Revelation, John the Baptist says, go and be baptized. And Oliver said, and we went and were baptized. And to make a long story short, we go through a lot of details, but piecing it all together, it turned out that they were going up to the hillside where Joseph Knight said that Joseph Smith kept the golden plates buried in the hillside. And that was actually where his maple grove was. So it was a wooded grove of trees on his property. It was cleared down along the river. There were no trees down there for privacy. So it helped understand the wording a little bit better. And I went around to a bunch of my colleagues. If you look in the Pearl of Great Price, there's a footnote in there from Oliver Cowdery back, and where he talks about that event. And he talks about, you know, John the Baptist coming and saying, on you, my fellow servants, I give, you know, the lesser priesthood, so on. And it wasn't the same words that Joseph Smith used. And they were using a different language there. And so I went first around to the Joseph Smith papers, folks who were just 2 aisles down from me. The rest of our floor area is the Joseph Smith papers. I said, well, what do you think of those differences? They said, oh, well, I'd give primacy to Joseph Smith's account. Oliver Cowdery's is a footnote. And then I asked Glenn Rowe, who is a dear soul that I greatly admire. Anything he says, I think, is got to be true. And he said, oh, well, I consider them both scripture. They're both in the scriptures. They're both scripture. I thought, okay, that seems to make sense to me, but they're different. And I followed through their history and how they developed. And Joseph Smith had read Oliver Cowdery's words. And then he took, and 2 months before he published his account of John the Baptist coming, he had Oliver Cowdery's account republished in the newspaper. And so he gave it value, he considered it correct, he shared it with the members of the church. He wanted them to know that account before he shared his. Well, why? Oliver's, I've concluded that Oliver's account was the actual words. And it fits, if you read through that, it fits with the setting. He's describing exactly what happened. Joseph Smith's account is, it's designed to teach. He's using words like Aaronic priesthood, which he didn't know that word until in Kirtland, when he received the revelation on the subject. But he's trying to be clear in what it is that they're talking about. And so understanding that context and how Oliver Cowdery's revelation came, how Oliver Cowdery's account came out and was published beforehand, helped me to see that Joseph Smith was trying to accomplish something much more than simply just recording dialogue that he had heard. He's trying to put that in a larger context. And there are other things in there too about the sons of Levi and so on, that he also changes a little bit because he's trying to accomplish specific things with his account that Oliver Cowdery was not as concerned with. He was just repeating what he had heard. from John the Baptist. And so understanding the location, being able to place Joseph and Oliver up in the woods on that, it was a rainy day. Oliver says that the May sunbeams shone down because it cleared in the afternoon. They were able to go up there, away from the abodes of men, into the woods. Joseph says, Oliver says, into the bush. You know, you can think of the sugar bush where they went, and it helped me to make greater sense of that context. And it's one thing we're trying to reach out to members around the world better, so that they have that same access, that they can go to these sites and get a sense of the setting, because it helps us understand the language and the words better. Thanks to COVID, we now have a wonderful virtual tour program going on historic sites, where you can sign up to go to any one of the sites across the world, but it's across the United States right now. But you can go to any one of those sites, and you can explore those sites with a missionary and get a sense of the setting, what it looked like, and how those events unfolded. And I think it helps us appreciate the language of the scriptures, but God's language as he was communicating the scriptures better as well.
Thank you. And I would encourage our listening audience to take advantage of that virtual tour opportunity. And it's now time to take questions from that audience. I'd like to begin with the first one, which reads as follows. The Book of Mormon frequently uses an English that was used around the time of the King James Bible in 1611, with many words not even used in 1820s American English of Joseph Smith's culture. Do you think the D&C uses similar language as the Book of Mormon English?
That's a little bit of a complex question. I think that the research now is suggesting partly the language of the English of the Book of Mormon is even earlier than King James English. And it doesn't quite fit with Joseph Smith's social context. Joseph Smith, I read a recent biography of him where the author suggested that the Book of Mormon was written in the Palmyra English that Joseph grew up speaking. Joseph grew up speaking a different dialect of English than was spoken in Palmyra, New York. He spoke Eastern New England dialect, which was spoken in Vermont and in Eastern Massachusetts. And Palmyra spoke Western New England dialect. And the differences are subtle, pronunciations a little different, but that's how you can get some later authors that are very critical of Lucy Mack Smith, for example, and treat her as speaking like a hillbilly because she did speak differently than they did. But the Book of Mormon does use, particularly in the biblical passages, a language that's in the Bible. There's lots of vocabulary that's biblical, and you find that in the Doctrine and Covenants as well. Is that conscious from Joseph Smith that he's using that? Is that the way the revelations come? I don't know. But what I find is that the cultural grammar, the structure of the Doctrine and Covenants revelations and the ideas are very much a part of Joseph's world, less than the Book of Mormon. I can't read the Book of Mormon and project 19th century America into them. I know some people have done that, but I don't think it works well.
The next question is a very interesting one. Could you comment on the developmental aspect of Joseph Smith's grammar as his revelations changed from personal requests to the group dynamics of hearken, O ye people, or elders in Kirtland to the whole world?
That is a really good question, and it deserves a lot more thought than I can give it right now. But let me give it a good stab, and that is that Joseph, I don't think in terms of, I think that the grammar's still there. I think Joseph's still receiving these revelations in terms of his world and his context, but he's learning to project. He's seeing these revelations as not just to him or to his friends, but to a people. You know, and hearken, O ye people, I think is the idea that they move from just an individual collection of believers to a community of believers who are trying to accomplish something together. And so some of the revelations, the ideas of consecration, for example, that are addressed in a number of revelations, I think that they're building on cultural concepts that are very contemporary to them. The disciples of Christ, some parts of them, the Morley family, for example, had heavily emphasized those. Joseph's taking that and applying it to their community through inspiration and revelation. But yeah, this deserves a lot more thought. I don't know that I'm fully answering that question right now the way I think it deserves it, but I think that he is moving in that direction of being able to kind of speak in a larger way to a larger community.
Thank you. Next question. How has breaking the revelations up into verses instead of paragraphs changed the understanding of the Doctrine and Covenants and the other scriptures, and why did they do it?
Well, if I can channel Orson Pratt, I'm not sure that he ever suggested why, but I think he's trying to make it more like the biblical material, where it's easier to find. We can all turn to a verse. You know, I've never read the Book of Mormon in its unversified format. I have read, or the Doctrine and Covenants, I have read the Book of Mormon that way, and it does make a big difference in the way you think about it. I think it was more to allow members to be able to talk about the details better, but I would think that it would be helpful to read them in their. I said I haven't read the Doctrine and Covenants that way, but I've read the individual revelations, of course, through the Joseph Smith papers and in other contexts, and I find it very helpful to read them in their entirety without the verses.
Thank you. Next question. Comment on Campbell's influence by the Scottish Enlightenment and the possible connections with Robert Owen's communities, with their strong influence in Ohio, and with the early interaction of Owenite Samuel Underhill on the early Mormonites.
Okay. When I approached this, several brilliant scholars had suggested that the Owenites, my Fawn Brody had suggested there had to be a connection between the Owenites and the Latter-day Saints early, but that had been dismissed by a number of brilliant scholars. I didn't assume that there were any connections, but as I looked further at Samuel Underhill and what was going on in the Kirtland area, he clearly was very much aware of the Latter-day Saints and what they were accomplishing. He wrote imitation Book of Mormon chapters trying to mock them. I found it really interesting that he seemed to find that he felt the Spirit, and he mocked that. He said, "Well, you know, that they're going to reject reason and go towards these emotional feelings that they have," and he had felt that as well. But rejected the influence of that emotional, that feeling for what he saw as a rational approach. The Owenites are practicing a form of communal organization where they're sharing all things in common. I think that that's where the Morty family gets their thoughts from, and that's how they start doing that. And so to an extent, this is part of that preparation. It's part of that cultural grammar that is developing, so that when Joseph Smith comes, they ask the right questions. They're asking questions about sharing property and about how we relate to each other economically, and questions that probably wouldn't have been asked had it not been for Samuel Underhill and the Owenites. And so I think that they had a profound influence for good on the Kirtland community, even though they rejected the spirit and relied solely on rational thought, which didn't lead them to the gospel.
Thank you. The next question is, can you situate the 1831 decision to publish Revelations in a book in the cultural context of the times?
Well, yeah, obviously what they're doing is new, and so you don't necessarily see lots of published revelations out there from a lot of people, but there are other churches are publishing spiritual experiences. You're getting ministers describing revelations. Books of letters from the Methodists, for example, are publishing books of letters that describe spiritual experiences that people have had, similar to Revelations. And so that idea is out there and going on. I think that what the Latter-day Saints are doing is a little bit different than that, because they're trying to make these revelations available for study and for action, not for just edification, but for directing one's life. You have the missionaries, for example, are copying over these revelations again and again, passing them on to each other, because everybody wants a copy. They see the value of those revelations, and they're trying to pass them around. Errors are getting into them. And this is a way of making that convenient, because you get as close to the ur-text as possible, as close to the original revelation, and you have it in a final form that you can take around and study. So I think that it's different, but similar in some ways to things that others are doing.
Thank you. Next question. Can you comment on the influence of the Shakers on members of the early church, particularly in Kirtland?
Yes. Lehman Copley, of course, was a Shaker who shared some of his property with the Saints, the Colesville Saints, initially settled there. There's a large Shaker community up in Shaker Heights, just southeast of Cleveland. And as I tried to follow the original 4 missionaries to Kirtland and describe their account when I was writing up that history, it was clear that they separated and that they're going in 2 groups. And a friend of mine, Max Parkin, had spent a lot of time studying Kirtland. I said, Max, it looks like they've separated a group into 2 different areas. And he said, yeah, I was thinking that too, that they're just not together. But as you follow, 2 of those missionaries head to Sidney Rigdon. The other 2 end up going to the Shaker community, and they get some hats from the Shakers, and that's how we know that they ended up there, because the newspapers are kind of ridiculing them for having had some interaction with the Shakers initially, but it seems to be positive. They seem to have some kind of a relationship there. And as they come down, the missionaries get back together right as they go to the Morty family. And not long after that, Lehman Copley joins the church in Thompson, and they start having success with just a couple of Shakers. But they go back by revelation to the Shaker community and read that revelation to them and try to convert them to the gospel. Parley B. Pratt is very negative, and it's interesting that he's one of the ones that didn't go to the Shakers initially. He went to Sidney Rigdon, and I don't know why, if it's something personal on his account or not, but he ends up having a negative interaction with the Shakers, dusting his coat as a sign of rejecting them and leaving. And Lehman Copley kind of stays behind, trying to smooth things over with them, but it ended up not going well. And after that, there were no real connections between the two communities.
Okay, we have one last question. We are running out of time, so perhaps a short answer to this one. Do you think that the Rigdon Partridge visit to Joseph Smith in New York occurred before, after, or at the same time as the Enoch translation of the Old Testament was received?
Really good question, and I'm not sure that that I have a good answer. When we were working on the harmony stuff, I talked to several scholars at BYU who had worked very carefully on the Bible translation as to if they thought that that had happened in harmony or if that had happened later. And as we talked it through, we decided that it had happened in harmony before Joseph went up to Waterloo, but there was no evidence to confirm that. It was just the conversation among a couple of people, and so we ended up not interpreting it there. I'm putting a Bible in that home to cover that story there, but since the question was, do I think, I'll say I think it happened in harmony, but I have no evidence.
Okay, just looking at the clock here, we could maybe give a 30-second response to the final question which someone just typed here. What do you learn doing the historical archaeology of the Morley Farm? I know that's an entire book by itself, but can you give just a brief summary?
Well, we haven't actually broken ground at the Morley Farm, but we've done a lot of reconnaissance and walking the site. It looks like a large complex. The homes all face together in a tight community centered on Isaac Morley's family. We know that Joseph Smith had a home there as well. We don't know exactly where that's at, but that's something we're still working on, and we hope in the future to understand that better.
Thank you very much. Once again, we want to thank Dr. Mark Staker for being our guest this evening. And to sum up what we've learned from him, he's talked about the importance of considering the language, particularly the cultural language of the revelations that were received by Joseph Smith, not only in Kirtland, but throughout his life, as well as considering the physical setting. And he mentioned that we have available to us virtual tours of church historic sites now. So even if we can't physically travel to those sites, we can still do a virtual tour that will allow us to better understand that physical or historical setting. We remind you again of next month's conversation, Church History in the World, The Word of Wisdom, featuring Drs. Kate Holbrook and Samuel M. Brown. Finally, we invite you to revisit tonight's conversation and previous conversations by tuning into the John A. Widtsoe Foundation website, www.widtsoefoundation.org. Thank you again, Mark, for being with us, and thank you, our audience, for listening, and have a good night.
All right.